Ronald Reagan liked to tell a particular story about himself. It was one of his favorite applause lines, a little gem he'd polish and deliver with that trademark genial grin. "I'm the only president of the United States who was ever president of a union." On its face, it's a powerful image. Here was a man who had walked picket lines, negotiated contracts, stood shoulder to shoulder with working people. A man who, by virtue of experience, must surely understand the struggles of ordinary laborers, whether on a factory floor in Michigan or a dusty cattle ranch in California. It's a line that made blue-collar voters feel like he was one of them, that he carried a piece of their world into the marbled halls of Washington. It turned Reagan into something rare, a conservative who could claim the mantle of labor, while pushing policies that overwhelmingly favored capital. But like so many of Reagan's favorite stories, it was part myth, part stagecraft, part carefully constructed character. Because the truth is, Ronald Reagan was always an actor, even when he wasn't standing under studio lights. And when he took on the role of Union president, he played it not as a champion of the rank and file, but as a reassuring face for the very forces that would end up hollowing out the power of working people. His time leading the Screen Actors Guild would shape his worldview in ways that became painfully clear when he eventually stepped onto the biggest stage of all. And in that story, from Hollywood negotiations to White House lawn, we see the contours of a uniquely American tragedy. The working man seduced by a smiling salesman, only to find the deal he signed left him holding the bag. By the mid-1940s, Hollywood was more than just America's dream factory. It was a fiercely contested battleground. The Second World War had left studios flush with profits, even as thousands of returning servicemen, including many young actors and stagehands, flooded back into the labor market. There was a surge in union activity across the country, and Hollywood was no exception. Actors, writers, directors, set painters, costume stitchers, they were all beginning to realize just how little of the booming entertainment economy actually trickled down to them. And with that realization came strikes, wildcat walkouts, and a steady rumble of worker solidarity that had studio bosses on edge. Into this atmosphere stepped Ronald Reagan. He was no studio titan. His movie career, though steady, had already begun to plateau. He'd spent the war years narrating training films for the Army Air Forces, never seeing combat overseas. By the time he returned, the roles that had once come easily had started to slip away. Younger, hungrier faces were arriving on lots every day. But Reagan had something else going for him. He was charming, affable, well-spoken, a good frontman, some would later say. He could give a speech that sounded like a fireside chat, calm a nervous crowd, or reassure anxious executives that everything wouldn't get out of hand. So when the Screen Actors Guild needed a steady figure to navigate tense contract negotiations and an undercurrent of labor radicalism, Reagan was a natural choice. He first served as a board member, then as third vice president. By 1947, he was elected president of SAG. This was no accident of timing. Studio heads preferred to deal with someone like Reagan, a personable mediator who understood their concerns and seemed unlikely to align himself too closely with the militant union organizers or left-wing agitators. Reagan, for his part, embraced the role. It offered him something his acting career increasingly did not: center stage. As SAG president, he became a fixture at industry banquets, labor conferences, and even congressional hearings. It gave him a new identity, that of the responsible statesman, a labor leader who could be counted on to keep Hollywood stable. And stable it was, at least for the studios. Under Reagan's leadership, SAG avoided major strikes, and labor unrest was kept largely in check. Reagan projected calm, but beneath that lay an unspoken promise to management that under his watch, the union would not become a vehicle for broader social or economic upheaval. His popularity among his peers grew, or at least held steady enough, that he was re-elected again and again, eventually serving 7 terms as SAG president. By the time he finally stepped down in 1959, Reagan had spent more years leading the union than he had ever spent in front of a camera. It was, in many ways, his first truly successful long-running role. Not as a heroic cowboy or soldier he often portrayed on screen, but as the calm, reassuring middleman who kept labor in line and management comfortable. But Reagan didn't just represent the actors. He also became a quiet partner to some of the most powerful forces determined to keep Hollywood and the country firmly in line. Not long after he took the reins at SAG, Reagan began working closely with the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau was obsessed with rooting out communism, which they believed was infiltrating every corner of American life, from steel mills to college classrooms, and especially the silver screen. Movies shaped hearts and minds. If communists were writing the scripts or delivering the lines, who knew what seditious ideas might sneak into America's living rooms? So the FBI cultivated informants throughout the industry. Reagan proved to be one of their most cooperative. Under the confidential code name T-10, Reagan routinely passed along the names of actors, writers, directors, and even union colleagues he suspected of harboring communist leanings. Some were avowed leftists who attended meetings or supported progressive causes. Others were merely people Reagan found ideologically suspect. In private reports to agents, he pledged to keep the Screen Actors Guild clean of radicals. He warned that some members were trying to turn the union into a vehicle for more than just collective bargaining. They wanted, he said, to use it as a platform for political action that would destabilize the industry. Then came the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, with its glare of congressional hearings, bright lights and TV cameras, and the dread that stalked every studio lot. Blacklists weren't a rumor. They were a fact of life. Writers, actors, directors who refused to cooperate, or even those who refused to name names, often found themselves unemployable overnight. And what did Reagan do? He didn't stand up for his union brothers and sisters. He didn't defend the principle that people shouldn't lose their livelihood over their private beliefs, or the principle that artistic freedom was worth a fight. Instead, Reagan told Congress that he would never work with known communists, and he cast the matter in familiar anti-union tones. He warned about small cliques trying to use the unions for subversive purposes. His testimony gave cover to the studios who were eager to purge troublesome employees under the banner of patriotic duty. This fervent anti-communism won Reagan powerful friends in Washington and in Hollywood's plush executive suites alike. Studio heads, after all, were terrified of strikes and left-wing demands that might eat into profits or disrupt production schedules. A union leader who made a public spectacle of hunting radicals, who cooperated with federal agents, who promised to keep things orderly and business-friendly, that was their kind of union man. A man who would keep the workforce compliant, who'd break the spine of union militancy long before it ever reached the negotiating table. In the end, Reagan's anti-communist crusade didn't just clear the sound stages of suspected Reds. It helped transform the entire culture of labor in Hollywood, replacing what might have been a vibrant movement for economic justice and artistic independence with a cold climate of fear, suspicion, and self-censorship. It also left an imprint on Reagan himself, teaching him that there was real power and prestige in siding with the forces of order over the demands of solidarity. That lesson would echo all the way from the studio backlots to the White House lawn. Then came one of the most consequential deals in Hollywood labor history, a deal that to this day still shapes the economics of acting. In the early 1950s, the entertainment landscape was beginning to shift under everyone's feet. Television was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a household fixture, beaming old movies and new productions directly into American living rooms. Studios saw both a threat and an opportunity. The threat of losing their exclusive hold on audiences, and the opportunity to endlessly monetize their film libraries by broadcasting and syndicating them. But for actors, it posed a terrifying question. If studios could keep airing a film or a TV episode year after year, paying nothing new to the people who brought those performances to life, what happened to the idea of fair compensation for creative work? Under Reagan's leadership, the Screen Actors Guild stepped into this new frontier. The union began negotiating with studios over what became known as residuals, payments to actors for the reuse of their work. It was a pioneering moment. Never before had there been a clear formula for compensating talent when their performances were recycled on this scale. Actors worried about being squeezed out of the boom in television and reruns. They wanted assurances that their work wouldn't keep generating profits for studios without sending anything back their way. But the studios drove a hard bargain. They painted doomsday scenarios of ballooning costs that might bankrupt the industry. They warned that too high a residual demand would simply kill off the reuse market before it ever took off. Reagan, ever the pragmatic dealmaker, agreed to a compromise. In exchange for securing a pension and health plan for SAG members, a critical safety net in an industry notorious for its booms and busts, the union accepted a much more limited framework for residual payments. This meant that actors got a guaranteed fund to help cover doctors' bills and old age, undeniably important, especially in the short term. But it also meant they surrendered vast future earnings. As studios began syndicating shows, reissuing films on new platforms, and eventually raking in cash from cable, VHS, DVDs, and streaming long after Reagan's time, actors found that they were entitled to only a fraction of the wealth their performances continued to generate. For top-billed stars who could negotiate their own lucrative back-end deals, this wasn't a crisis. But for the thousands of working actors, the character players, the day-rate performers, the sturdy backbone of the industry, it was a wound that never quite healed. They found themselves locked into a system designed in Reagan's day, with residual formulas that often underpaid or left them out entirely, while studios amassed billions on the enduring popularity of old content. Reagan, for his part, hailed it as a victory. He pointed to the stability it brought, the security actors gained, and the way it kept Hollywood humming without strikes or shutdowns. And in truth, many union members at the time celebrated. Health insurance and pensions were hard-won prizes in post-war America, especially in a profession where jobs could dry up overnight. But over the decades, the scale of the trade-off became painfully clear. Studios had effectively bought out labor peace and predictable costs, at the expense of sharing the colossal upside of film and television's long afterlife. It was a deal that fit neatly with the philosophy Reagan would later champion as president, that the promise of the market was best kept by letting the big players reap most of the rewards, trusting that somehow enough would trickle down. For the working actors whose faces still flicker across our screens, and who sometimes get checks so small they don't even cover dinner, the bargain struck under Reagan's leadership remains a reminder that not every contract signed in the name of security truly serves those who need it most. So even before Reagan ever set foot on a campaign trail for governor, long before he raised his hand on the Capitol steps to swear the presidential oath, the pattern was already unmistakable. He was a union leader, yes, but not the kind whose knuckles were scarred from picket lines, or whose speeches rallied the rank and file to demand more from the people at the top. Reagan was a different breed, a union man who worked hand in glove with studio bosses, with government agents, and with the architects of a system designed to keep labor compliant and profits soaring. When the studios needed a friendly face to negotiate a deal that would save them billions down the line, Reagan was there. When the FBI needed a trusted insider to quietly root out the political dissent in Hollywood, Reagan was there. When Congress came looking for witnesses to help fuel a blacklist that would ruin countless careers, Reagan didn't stand up for the accused. He stood aside and offered a polite nod. Time and again, he spoke of protecting working people, of safeguarding their futures, of ensuring stability. But the contracts he signed, the names he gave, the fears he stoked, and the compromises he championed all pointed to a man far more interested in maintaining order and in securing his own rise than in building real collective power. In the end, the myth of Reagan, the Union Man, was like so much else in his carefully crafted public life. A line delivered with perfect timing and practiced sincerity, designed to make ordinary people believe he was one of them. But behind the performance lay a different story entirely, one in which the benefits flowed upward and the burdens fell downward, and the applause lines masked who truly came out ahead. It was a role Reagan played with extraordinary conviction, from the Union Hall to the Oval Office. And it was a performance whose consequence would ripple outward for decades, shaping not just the fate of Hollywood labor, but the very balance of power between American workers and the forces of capital. Decades later, that myth still dances across our screens and seeps into our politics. We see it in the smiling portraits of Reagan hung in union halls that have long since lost their power to strike. We hear it in the speeches of politicians who invoke his name to promise prosperity, even while wages stagnate, pensions vanish, and the dream of secure health care slips further from reach. We see it every time a worker opens a residual check worth pennies, while a studio's quarterly profits crest another billion. Every time a warehouse worker is told to be grateful for flexible scheduling instead of demanding fair pay. Every time a laid-off factory hand is told the market knows best, and that someday, somehow, the benefits will trickle down. The myth of Reagan as champion of the working man endures because it is comforting. It offers an easy story that if a man like him, genial, patriotic, once a union president himself, could rise to power and still believe in the market's wisdom, then surely the system must work in the end. But myths have a cost. They can bind us to scripts written by others, scripts in which the people who do the work learn to accept less, while telling themselves that they're still winning. And so the ghost of Reagan's performance continues to haunt us, long after the curtain fell, reminding us how power can wrap itself in language of solidarity, even as it carefully, methodically, writes workers out of the final act.